Hello, I am Dr. Stephen Stosny, and welcome to our bootcamp follow-up on overcoming relationship destroyers: criticism, stonewalling, defensiveness, and contempt. Sounds like a fun evening, right? Now, the relationship destroyers were first noted and researched by John Gottman and subsequently have been affirmed by other researchers. He identified them as the four horsemen of the apocalypse. They predict divorce with over 90% accuracy. In fact, you can do this yourself with friends, friends who are a couple. Ask them to talk about any problem between them, either large or small. They choose what the problem is, and talk about it for 10 minutes. And if they do these four things, criticism, defensiveness, stonewalling, or contempt, you can predict they'll be divorced within 5 years, and you have better than 9 in 10 chances of being right. That's how powerful they are. Now, relationship killer number one is criticism. In my clinical experience, criticism is the most apocryphal because the other three tend to follow from it. Stonewalling, defensive, and contemptuous partners invariably feel criticized. So we're going to spend the most time on that because the others kind of grow out of it. Now, criticism is the only reliable form of autobiography. It was actually Oscar Wilde who said that. It tells you more about the psychology of the criticizer than those he criticizes. So if you hear someone criticizing, you can form a judgment about that person that's fairly accurate. Professionals can formulate a preliminary diagnosis just from hearing someone criticize someone else. So the content of the criticisms, whether it's right or not, isn't really how you would form that diagnosis. It's the tone of the criticism. Now, criticism is destructive to relationships when it is about personality or character rather than behavior. When it's filled with blame, not focused on improvement, based on only one right way to do things, and of course that's my way, or belittling. Now, criticism is almost always at least one of those, usually all of them, and that's why it is so predictive of divorce. All right, now the evolution of criticism in relationships, because rarely does a relationship start out with one or both parties being critical. In most cases, criticism starts out on a low key and escalates over time, forming a downward spiral with resentment. So this is how it goes. Criticism is a little bit of it in the beginning, and criticism almost always causes resentment. And then the criticizer steps up the criticism because they keep repeating it. They're getting more resentful. So that increases the resentment, which causes more vociferous criticism, more resentment, more criticism, until resentment is pretty much dominating your relationship, and that's the point where most of the people come to our boot camps. Because it's this downward spiral that almost always begins with criticism. Now, at no time in this downward spiral does an obvious effect occur to critical people. Criticism is an utter failure in regard to lasting behavior change. That's why you have to keep doing it and doing more and more of it. It doesn't work. Now, why doesn't it work? For one thing, it calls for submission, which always produces resentment simply because human beings hate to submit. So when I'm criticizing you, it's rarely in the form of me making a behavior request of you. It's making a demand that you have to submit to. Some animals like to submit. Humans hate it, though. It also devalues. It has a devaluing tone. I'm smarter than you, wiser, know more about this, have more acumen in some way. So your value is lowered by it. Now, while people hate to submit, we like to cooperate. Cooperation is integral to the survival of our species and to our well-being. So there's a built-in reward for humans when we feel like we cooperate. Now here's the key to getting cooperation. The valued self cooperates, the devalued self resists. If you want cooperation, show value for the person you want to cooperate with you. If you want resistance, criticize. It's really as simple as that. That's why it always fails. It devalues and calls for submission, where you don't really want submission, you want cooperation, and that means you have to show value. Now, critical people are certainly smart enough to figure out that criticism doesn't work. So why do they keep doing it? Because if you probably heard that joke, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. And that's really what criticism is. Criticism is an easy form of ego defense. That's really why we keep doing it. It's defending the ego. We don't criticize because we disagree with a behavior or an attitude. We criticize because we somehow feel devalued by the behavior or attitude. It seems to challenge our authority, control, judgment, etc. So the critical person's not expressing disagreement. They're devaluing because they're feeling devalued. Critical people tend to be intolerant of disagreement and easily insulted, both of which indicate low core value. Now, for those of you who haven't been to our boot camp, core value is the ability to create value and meaning in your life, which makes the sense of self stronger and more flexible. So when you have that ability to create value and give your life meaning and purpose, your sense of self automatically becomes stronger and more flexible, so you can countenance disagreement. You're confident in your own views, and you're not you don't need everybody else to agree with you. So criticism indicates a need for core value work, and that is the only reliable way to stop it. There really isn't a relationship remedy for criticism, like what does one partner have to do or what the other partner should do. It has to be raising your own core value so that you don't feel devalued so easily, and if you don't feel devalued, you won't devalue back. When people always ask, so what do I say when he's critical, or how do I express this so it's not critical? The answer is always go to your core value. If you're in a state of core value, you won't be critical. You will make a behavior request, and you won't internalize anyone else's criticism. Now, criticism is a learned behavior. Critical people are usually criticized in early childhood by caretakers, siblings, or peers. Parents get a lot of blame for it, but it's almost as often siblings or peers that instill criticism, especially in young children. Now, criticism can be especially painful for young children. The reason for that is they cannot distinguish criticism of their behavior from personal rejection. That's a higher cognitive process. Criticism means they're bad and unworthy. Distinguishing behavior from the self is an advanced prefrontal cortex operation that young children cannot do. So no matter how we try to do it, say you're a good kid, this behavior is bad, a child under 7 is not going to be able to make that distinction. Even over 7, they're not that good at it. Now, the reason it's so painful to them is the only thing that young children can do to survive is attach emotionally to people who will take care of them. They can't take care of themselves, so they have to form an emotional bond with someone who will take care of them. So feeling unworthy of the attachment bond, which is what they feel when they're criticized, seems like life or death to them. So they try to control the great pain of criticism by turning it into self-criticism. Self-inflicted pain is controlled and far better than unpredictable rejection by loved ones. So even though it's very bad for me to criticize myself, at least I'm in control of that, and it's predictable. And pain that you inflict on yourself is always better than pain somebody else inflicts on you. By early adolescence, they begin to identify with the aggressor, emulating the more powerful criticizer. That's a term where they recognize that the person doing the criticizing seems more powerful than the person getting criticized. So they begin to identify with the aggressor and become more critical themselves. By late adolescence, self-criticism morphs into criticism of others. And by young adulthood, it seems to be entirely criticism of others. It's still self-criticism at heart, but you can't notice that because they're criticizing everybody else in their cone of perception. Now, how to tell if you're critical? You're likely to be the last person to know that you're critical. And the reason for that is criticism keeps you focused on how other people are behaving, so you're not really reflecting on yourself very much. And also, there's only a very small sliver of your prefrontal cortex, far less than 1% of it, that goes to objectively analyzing your own behavior. And that part gets no blood during emotional arousal. And since most criticism occurs when the person's feeling frustrated, by definition they're emotionally aroused, so they're not able to objectively analyze their own behavior or even really remember the state they were in or quite what they said when they were being critical, because that part of the brain is also offline. The critical brain is hyper-focused on what is wrong in the environment, and as a result, the very small part of the prefrontal cortex that goes objectively analyzing their own behavior is simply offline. Now, if someone says you're critical, you probably are. So you can take that at face value. Rarely will somebody accuse someone else of being critical if they're not at least feeling criticized. Now, here's an even better way to tell. Think of what you automatically say to yourself if you drop something or make a mistake. In other words, your reflexive thing that you say to yourself. Psychologists call those automatic thoughts. Critical people will typically think or say, oh, you idiot, or you're asshole, or just curse or sigh in disgust. There's something really devaluing about dropping the thing or making a mistake. If you're self-critical, if you do those things, that means you're self-critical. And if you're self-critical, you most likely do it to others. Now, criticism versus feedback. Critical people often delude themselves into thinking that they merely give feedback to help others improve. In fact, there's that old joke, you're critical, I give helpful feedback. Or you're stubborn, I'm firm. You're wishy-washy, I'm flexible. That's because of that absent part of the prefrontal cortex. When you're emotional, you don't objectively analyze your own behavior. But critical people often think they're just giving feedback. Now, the following are ways to distinguish criticism from constructive feedback. Criticism focuses on what's wrong. For example, why can't you pay attention to the bills? So it's focused on the mistake or whatever is wrong. Feedback focuses on how to improve. Let's go over the bills together, for instance. Criticism implies the worst about the other's personality. You're stubborn and lazy. Sometimes you'll say that, but criticism will often imply it. Feedback is about behavior, not personality. Why don't we start by sorting the bills by their due date? Criticism devalues. I guess you're just not smart enough to do this. Now, rarely will people say that, but it is implied in the emotional demeanor because, remember, criticism is devaluing. Feedback encourages. I know you have a lot on your plate, but I'm pretty sure we can do this together. Criticism implies blame. It's your fault we're in this financial mess. Feedback is focused on the future. We can get out of this mess if we both give up a few things. See, criticism implies blame. Blame's always about the past, how we got here. But you have to improve and solve problems in the future. That's why blame never leads to solutions. It's the wrong time frame and the wrong part of your brain. Criticism attempts to control. I know what's best. I'm smarter, more educated, therefore you have to do what I want. Feedback respects autonomy. I respect your right to make that choice even though I don't agree with it. Criticism is coercive. You're going to do what I want or else I won't connect with you or will punish you in some way. There's some coercive element to criticism. You damn well better do this. Where feedback is not at all coercive. I know we can find a solution that works for both of us. That's the subtext of feedback. Criticism, you have to do this. Feedback, we can find something that works for us. Now, warning, you can give feedback only in your core value. If you're not in your core value, in other words, if you're angry, resentful, frustrated, and so on, any attempt at feedback will be heard as criticism no matter how you put it. In fact, I counsel people, don't focus on what to say, because you probably have already lost if you're doing that. People respond to emotional tone, not intention. If you're focused on what to say, you're going to be either too anxious or too frustrated, and that's going to make the emotional tone negative. So get into your core value and before you offer feedback. Regulate any anger or resentment before you try to give feedback. All right, now here's a criticism exercise. Do this if you're self-critical or if your partner thinks you're critical. This is an exercise we actually do in the boot camp, but I want to expand on it and have you spend more time on it. Now, part one is think of when you were a very young child. Go back as far as you can remember, and you made a mistake for which you were criticized or punished. But this wasn't a one-time deal. This was your gut feeling does, here we go again, I screwed up again or something like that. And I'll give you an example of something a client wrote, just so you see the tone that it should take. I wet the bed until I was 8 years old, not every night, but now and then. My parents criticized me like I did it on purpose. They said I was too lazy to get up and go to the bathroom. My older brother teased me mercilessly and told kids at school, and they all mocked me. I felt totally inadequate and unlovable. I still dream about wetting the bed nearly 50 years after it stopped. All right, so try to imagine criticism or punishment in as much detail as you can and describe what you thought and felt. And be sure to identify your deepest core hurt, which is going to be inadequate or unlovable. And that's what this person just did. Now, this was a pretty dramatic example. This is very shame-invoking. Yours doesn't have to be that dramatic, but it just shows you how powerful it is if it can overcome something like that that's even more traumatic. Now, part two, criticism repair. Invoke the emotions of your core value bank. Take a couple of seconds to run through it. Now, for those who did not attend the boot camp, I'll guide you through it. The core value bank is just a tool we use to get you from a devalued state into a core value state. So you want to imagine that you're comforting this desperate child. You see this child that's really upset, and only you can help. You're the only person around, so you're going to make her feel better. And whatever you're doing, it's working. She's calming down. She's feeling not afraid. She's feeling peaceful and good because of you and what you're doing. Think of the most important thing about you as a person and the most important thing about your life in general. This is sort of what you would want on your tombstone. For most people, that's what meaning and purpose is, and for most people, that's At the end of the day, being caring to the people you love, being compassionate to the people you love. Think of the people you love, that feel the significant, feel the love you have for the significant people in your life. Feel your spiritual connection, being able to relate to something larger than yourself. Think of something beautiful in nature. Think of something beautiful human-made, your favorite art or music or furniture or jewelry. Doesn't matter what it is, but you think it's beautiful. And think of a community connection. That's where you feel connected to a group of people based on shared values, goals, or experiences. That can be a church, school, work, professional, neighborhood, civic, athletic, artistic community, anything like that. And think how you feel when you do small, compassionate things. The definition of a compassionate behavior is that helps someone else with no material gain to you. So it can be small things like helping people struggling with a package or talking to someone when they're down, that kind of thing. Now, from your core value, describe what makes the criticized child valuable and worthy of love. Now, note, you can't just say it. The child must imagine doing something that makes him or her feel valuable and lovable. And I'll read what this client wrote. It's okay, you'll get a handle on it. It'll stop one day. What's wetting the bed is what he's referring to. You're a good kid. You love your parents. You love your dog. You like doing good for other people. See, that's the important part. You have to be able, you can't just say you're lovable and valuable. You have to imagine something that makes you feel that way. When this child imagines loving his parents or his dog, then he feels lovable. Now, part 3, stopping the cycle, because self-criticism leads to criticism of others. We have to do something about that part of it. So think of a time you criticized or punished your significant other. Try to imagine the criticism or punishment in as much detail as you can and describe what he or she thought and felt. Be sure to identify his or her deepest core hurt, which will be inadequate or unlovable. And this is what the client wrote. I criticized her for drinking, not as a health issue or for her own well-being, but because I didn't like it. I ridiculed her, said she was weak, selfish, and disgusting. She felt totally unlovable and inadequate, just like I did as a kid. She felt like she was all alone in her problem, like I did. You see, that's very often what you're trying to do with criticism, recreate in the criticized person that powerless feeling that you felt as a child. Now, invoke the emotions of your core value bank. Run through those boxes as quickly as you can. And from your core value, describe what makes your partner valuable and worthy of love. And this is what the client wrote. She is very competent and a hard worker. She's generous, sacrificing, and highly moral. She has made me a better person. All right, now turn to your partner now. If your partner's not with you, do it in your imagination and describe how valuable he and she is to you and what he or she does well. It's important that you actually do that because criticism completely overlooks all the positive things. You might know them in your head, but I guarantee your criticized partner isn't hearing them. And you've got to be able to make up for the criticism by stating what makes your partner valuable and what your partner does well. Whenever you have an urge to criticize, recall how you felt when you were criticized as a young child. You don't want to create that powerless feeling in your loved ones and undermine their confidence. All right, now how to give feedback. Give feedback from your core value. Focus on how to improve. Focus on the behavior you would like to see, not on the personality of your partner or child, whoever you're criticizing or wanting to give feedback to. Encourage achievement instead of undermining confidence. See, the real negative thing, one of the real negative things about criticism is that it will undermine confidence. Which is another reason it doesn't work. You're asking somebody to do better, but you're undermining their confidence to do it. Sincerely offer to help. Respect his or her autonomy. And do not punish or withdraw affection if he or she doesn't do what you want. So that's the way to give feedback. Giving feedback is great in relationships, but you've got to be careful that it has these components and that you're in your core value when you do it, particularly if you have a history of being critical in your relationship, and you probably wouldn't be watching this webinar if that were not the case. So the residual effect of past criticism is going to need some time for you to repair that, and following this formula can help you repair it. Now all of this will help, but remember, you have to give feedback in your core value. That's the most important element, with your resentment and anger regulated for it to be successful. Okay, relationship killer number 2, stonewalling. Stonewalling is refusal to consider your partner's perspective. If you listen at all, you do it dismissively or contemptuously. You see that contemptuous look on his face. That's what it means. Here we go again. No, he's not saying anything, but the contempt's being communicated. Even though they're on the phone, I guarantee she knows he's being contemptuous. Stonewalling is not taking time out to calm down or collect your thoughts. So don't confuse it with a timeout. Timeouts are respectful and not blaming. Once you've cooled off or have collected your thoughts, you re-engage to negotiate. So that's what a timeout is. Stonewalling is different. This is the song of the stonewaller. Just leave me alone. Do whatever you want. End of conversation. Stop talking. Get out of my face. That's enough. I've had it. That's what stonewalling is. That's not collecting your thoughts. That's not asking for a timeout. It's disrespectful, and it is blowing off the other person. Now, the other divorce predictive behaviors, criticism, defensiveness, and contempt, are gender neutral. In other words, men and women do it more or less equally. But stonewalling is far more likely to be a male thing. In fact, it's the defensive choice of most men. When women stonewall, it's usually a function of temperament. They're introverted, shy, or inhibited. Or, more likely, it's a learned behavior. Engaging in conversation in the past has exposed her to put-downs or abuse. So she's learned not to engage because no good's going to come out of it. So it's not natural for most women to do it. It's either a function of a very introverted or shy personality or a learned behavior or a combination. Even little boys do it. Stonewalling is more natural to males because, in general, males of all social animals, not just humans, have a more rapid arousal level. In other words, they get aroused in emotions. They spike up in emotions where women have more of a gradual increase in intensity. Stonewalling is a way of shutting out stimulation that spikes arousal, because that spike in arousal is very uncomfortable for men. So a lot of emotional energy they spend trying to keep it down. And stonewalling is an external way of trying to do that. You're going to shut out any stimulation coming in so that it doesn't get overwhelming. Males also have a smaller corpus callosum, which makes it easier to cut off information from the emotional parts of the brain. Women's corpus callosum is like a 4-lane highway, where men is a 1-lane country road. One car at a time goes over it. And then there's also cultural reinforcement, the icon of the strong, silent male. So men get cultural reinforcement for stonewalling, unfortunately. I guess I didn't explain what difference the corpus callosum means. That's the tissue that connects the two hemispheres of the brain. The emotional part of the brain is in the right hemisphere, so men can cut that off more easily because there's fewer connective tissues conveying information from the emotional part to the more analytical part, where it's harder for women to cut that off. Men tend to think or feel, but not do both at once. Women are much better at doing both at once. Or men talk and feel, but not both at once. If you really want a man to talk, he's got to kind of shut down his feelings a little bit. And if he really is going to be in touch with his feelings, it's going to be very hard for him to talk. So that's a function of that smaller corpus callosum. They can learn to do better, of course. I'm not saying they should just clam up. But it's not as natural for them. They have to learn to be able to feel and talk at the same time. Now, the effects of stonewalling are also differential by gender. It's frustrating to men who are stonewalled because it blocks the goal of resolution. They're trying to talk something out or get some kind of closure or resolution on something, and their partners are stonewalling. It's very frustrating. Frustration is often misused. What it literally means is your goal is being blocked. You're trying to do something, and the paradigm of that is you're screwing in a screw and it keeps dropping to the ground. I'm terrible around the house, so whenever I screw something, try to screw a screw, it drops at least 10 times before I get it in. So that's what frustration really is, and that's how men feel when they are stonewalled. However, it is actually painful to women who are stonewalled because it makes them feel isolated and unloved. So men are underestimating the effect it has on their women. They're assuming that when you're stonewalling them, the worst it's going to be is a little bit frustrating for them. And she's nagging anyway, so she can take a little frustration. It's different because of the fear of isolation that the females of most social animals have. She feels isolated in her hurt when you do that, and it's very painful. It's almost like slapping her in the face. If you're a man, think of how bad humiliation feels. That's how isolation feels to your partner. So you get a kind of backdoor empathy of it, but not with the same emotion. You have to substitute humiliation, as bad as that feels for you. That's how isolation feels for her. Stonewalling comes so naturally to many men that we're often unaware that we do it. And here's a sure sign that you're doing it. If you believe your partner is nagging, you are not listening. The nagging partner is the unheard partner. So if you're thinking you wish she would just leave it alone, or why does she keep bringing that up, it's because she's feeling unheard. Now, there's two kinds of stonewalling. There's aggressive versus defensive. The aggressive stonewaller knows that the silence, cold shoulder, and emotional isolation hurt his partner. He's very aware of it. He's doing it on spite or to really afflict harm. He stonewalls to gain leverage or power in the relationship. So that's characteristic of battering relationships, where you're systematically trying to control or dominate your partner. Now, the defensive stonewaller, and in my experience, that's far more common, at least in the non-court-ordered domestic violence offender population. Even in them, though, I find that even violent people, their stonewalling is primarily defensive, although they do some aggressive too. For them, the conflict is overwhelming, so they are feeling criticized, they're feeling overwhelmed, they're feeling like you're putting a guilt trip or making them feel shame. and that's why they're doing the stonewalling. It seems that the only tactic they have, the only choice they have, is to shut it out because it's so overwhelming, and that's what stonewalling is, or to crush it with aggression, which they don't want to do. Now here's something you really have to get if you're a stonewaller. It feels different on the inside from the way it looks on the outside. While it can look aggressive, mean, or childish from the outside, on the inside, stonewalling feels defensive. He feels like he's just trying to protect himself. And it can even feel protective. I stonewalled quite a bit in the early part of my marriage, and I actually was convinced that I was doing it to protect my wife because I grew up in a very violent home. Both of my parents were, put each other in a hospital kind of violent. And I never wanted my wife to see that kind of anger or rage. So I'd actually never experienced that kind of anger or rage, but I was always afraid that I would because it was modeled so much for me. So I thought I was protecting her by shutting her out. So I didn't realize the harm it was doing to her. Now, why we stonewall? There's really only one reason, and that's to avoid feeling inadequate. The engagement, if we engage, we're going to feel inadequate. We can't handle it. But like all avoidance strategies, stonewalling reinforces feelings of inadequacy, or else we would need to do it. So just the fact that you need to do it is telling you that you're inadequate. You're not inadequate. It's telling you feel inadequate, but because you're acting on the feeling, it's convincing you that you are inadequate. So the more you do it, the more it seems that you need to do it because it's self-reinforcing. The brain becomes convinced that we can't handle it. So you probably notice if you're a stonewaller, you're doing more and more of it. Certainly your partner has noticed it, because your threshold of feeling overwhelmed gets lower and lower. You can't handle it. Also, if you're doing it that much, it's going to be leading to depression. Now, the way out of this is you must see inadequacy as a motivation, not a punishment. Everything that you've ever done in your life that required a certain level of skill, you were inadequate at doing when you first tried it. The discomfort of inadequacy motivated you to learn how to do it. And then you replace the powerlessness of inadequacy with the powerful feelings of competence and mastery. See, inadequacy is about as bad as it can get for men. That's the most dreaded emotional state. And probably as good as it gets is feeling competent and masterful. That's how that's a great feeling for a man, to feel competent and masterful. So we use the motivation, we use inadequacy as a motivation to get to feel competent and masterful. You've done it over and over and over in your life. So rather than stonewalling, that is succumbing to the feelings of inadequacy, we must use it as a motivation to learn how to be better partners and parents if you're stonewalling your children. Running from inadequacy makes it stronger. Facing it head-on empowers you. So here's a stonewalling exercise. Describe a time that you stonewalled your partner. And then identify your deepest core hurt. And it's going to be inadequate, almost always. This is what I will do to make myself feel adequate and lovable. If you're stonewalling your partner, unlovable is going to be hidden in there. It's primarily feeling inadequate, but unlovable, if it's someone you love, is hidden because your brain's saying, if she loved me, she wouldn't be doing this. She's doing this, which means I'm not really lovable. Or if I were really lovable, she wouldn't feel so pissed off at me or be making these demands on me. Now, this is the most important step, what I do to make myself feel adequate and lovable, because you've got to be able to see that you have the power within you to make yourself feel empowered. You don't need that to come from your partner. It comes from within you. Now, this is my significant other's deepest core hurt caused by my stonewalling. That's almost always going to feel unlovable, because she feels if you loved her, you would want to engage her, not make her feel isolated in her hurt. Now, once you realize that she's feeling unlovable, and of course the last thing you want is for her to feel unlovable, then you can make a core value decision that your connection is more important than your impulse to stonewall. You will probably have the impulse to stonewall your whole life. But a core value decision, that means what's more important to you. That impulse to stonewall might be important, but more important than that is the connection to your loved ones. Because that is where your core value is. That is where the meaning and purpose in your life is. The meaning and purpose of your life is not in stonewalling. It's in the connection to your partner. So just every time you feel like stonewalling, run through this exercise. I will try. Now turn to your partner right now. She's not with you. Do it in your imagination. And state, I will try hard to connect with you when I feel like stonewalling. Now the impulse to stonewall, the more you do this, the more you step up to the plate and face it head on, the easier it gets, because you'll find that you are far more adequate than stonewalling has taught you that you are. So takes a little nerve to do it at first. It's like the analogy I give for this, I used to do some counseling for baseball players when they get hit in the head with a pitch. Because they have a reflex to flinch at a high inside fastball whenever they step up to the plate. And if they succumb to that, their career will be over, because once that gets around to the league, all they're going to see is high inside fastball. So it's really working on them to desensitize that anxiety so they can hang in there and what they call it owning the inside of the plate, not flinch and back off when the ball's coming at them and coming at their heads after they've been hit. And it's really gut-wrenching at first until they get used to it, and then it gets easier and easier, and there's a recovery period. Baseball, it's usually about 20, 25 at-bats, and then they're okay. And it's going to probably be about 20 iterations where you're going to feel like stonewalling, and you face up to it and engage, and you'll find it becomes much easier. Now, whenever you have the urge to stonewall, do the above exercise. Think of what is most important to you and about you, and be the partner you most want to be. Now, if you've been to our boot camp, you got this Argument and Sulk CD. It has a fire extinguisher on it, and the purpose of that is the fire extinguisher effect. That is, fire extinguisher effect is homes that have fire extinguishers have fewer fires if they keep the fire extinguishers out where they can see them. If they have a fire extinguisher and put it in the closet, it doesn't prevent fires. Now, there's an intervening variable there. Obviously, the presence of the fire extinguisher does nothing to prevent fires, but if you see it in your environment all the time, it reminds you to subliminally to be careful. So you turn off the gas, you check the battery in the smoke alarm, and those things that actually do prevent fires. So you keep this out all the time. That'll help prevent this sulking and stonewalling. And if you find yourself doing it, put the CD on until it reminds you of your core value. Okay, relationship killer number 3, defensiveness. Defensiveness predicts divorce with over 90% accuracy because it invalidates or minimizes the partner's hurt. It doesn't matter that you're hurt because I'm right. That's the subtext. So you're going to be arguing why you're right, what the facts are, and what's lost in that is the fact that your partner is hurt. So it's implying that, or you have no right to be hurt because I didn't mean to hurt you. Or more aggressively, you're just too sensitive. So that's why defensiveness is so harmful, because it's isolating your partner, telling them they don't have a right to feel the way they do. Now, like stonewalling, defensiveness affects men and women differently. Men don't like it. It's frustrating when their partners are defensive. You know, you say, well, you just own it already, stop being evasive. But it's actually painful for women when their defensive partners make them feel isolated and they're hurt. And again, it's that fear of isolation. You don't care that I'm hurt. That's what they're hearing when you argue about the facts. You know, I had an email today from someone who was defending himself when his partner said he was being critical. And he was defending himself by going through all these facts that he was right. And that had even more a negative effect than the original criticism. So the guiding principle is don't defend your ego. Defensiveness is always about your ego. You have to show that you're right. You're justified in the way you're thinking. Forget about that. Enhance your core value. Your core value is more important than your ego. In fact, your ego is only important to you when your core value is low. When your core value is high, you're not even thinking in terms of defending an ego. In a love relationship, the impulse to defend your ego has to be a signal to get to your core value. The need to get to core value is strongest when your partner's pain is expressed in anger, which makes it sound accusatory and punishing. And very often it is, especially if you've been defensive or critical for quite a while. It's not going to come out as hurt and pain anymore. It's going to come out as resentment and anger. And it's going to be accusatory and punishing. Something like, you never listen to me. You just care about yourself. You're cold, inconsiderate, and selfish. That's when you really need to get to your core value. Or otherwise, you'll just be in a power struggle and go back and forth in a toddler. One of you saying mine, the other one saying no, and you don't get anywhere. If you want to change that pattern, you must go to your core value. The core value response, that is the most honest, sincere, and consistent with your deeper values, is something like, you're right, I need to listen to you more. I sometimes get distracted, but I want you to know, always know, that I care about you. We need to be respectful and caring to each other. See, that is, I added that we need to be respectful and caring to each other because you do want to remind your partner that they're being a little too critical in their response to you. But what's most important is you own your part of it. I need to listen to you more. Now here's a defensiveness exercise. Briefly describe an incident when your partner thought you were defensive. For example, that's not true. I listen to you most of the time. My core value response, for example, I gave this example because that's my blind spot, is I am continually thinking about something I'm writing, a book or something, or what I'm going to be saying to a boot camp or public speaking while my wife's talking to me. It's a terrible habit, and I try not to do it, but I slip into it a lot. My impulse, and what I used to say early in our marriage, you never listen to me. That's not true. I listen to you most of the time, and I want to point out all the times I listen to her. She wants perfection. I'm human, that kind of thing. But the core value response is, I don't want you to feel unheard. I will try to pay more attention. Maybe it would help if we set aside an uninterrupted time for just the two of us to talk. Because a lot of times not listening is because there's too many distractions going on. It's a funny thing about the effects of testosterone and estrogen on focusing. Testosterone actually makes it easier to, makes you focus better, but it makes it more difficult to focus. So it's harder to focus, but once you do focus, it's easier to, you focus with more depth, and it's more laser-like focus. And then once you're distracted, it's harder to refocus with testosterone. Now with estrogen, it's a little easier to focus and to refocus if you get distracted. It's one of the reasons women multitask better. But your focus isn't as sharp. In fact, it's hard to focus on just one thing at a time. That's what estrogen does. So I'm always amused at these differences because it's like God made us with half a brain and we have to come together to get a whole brain. But anyway, the core value response is I never want my wife to feel unheard, and I'm going to try to pay more attention. And if you focus on that, you don't get that defensiveness standoff where you're arguing one thing, she's arguing another, and you both feel frustrated, unseen, unheard, and resentful. Okay, relationship killer number 4, contempt. In love relationships, contempt occurs at the end of a long chain of resentment. As the chain accumulates links, that means various things you resent. If you can think of each thing you resent, nobody resents just one thing. There's always a chain of things. And the longer that chain gets, you begin to see your partner as an opponent. So you don't think of your partner as a teammate working toward a better life. You see your partner as your opponent in achieving a better life. Now, by the time the chain reaches contempt, in other words, as bigger that chain gets, it gets more harder, it gets more bitter until it finally turns into contempt. By the time it's contempt, you're seeing your partner as an enemy. He or she is actually out to obstruct your well-being. So it's not just they're opposing what you want in life, they're trying to make you feel bad. They're trying to make you fail, not have a good life. Now, contempt puts relationships in critical condition. Left on their own, they will certainly deteriorate and die. They're salvageable, but it takes heroic kinds of intervention to change them. They will not change on their own. You have to make a determined effort to change them. Contempt makes you see the problem not in the way you interact or regulate emotions, which it almost always is. But once you're contempt, you don't see it that way anymore. The problem is in the character of your partner. He or she is defective in some way, immoral, selfish, unstable, personality disordered, or stupid. There's something wrong with him or her. That's what you're convinced the problem is when you're contemptuous. So these are contemptuous attributions. You're lazy, selfish, inconsiderate, crazy, abusive, have a personality disorder, etc. And you'll go on the internet and pick out all these symptoms of whatever your partner has. And whatever you look for on the internet, you're going to find. And I guarantee if you find your partner in a personality disorder checklist, I think those should be banned because personality disorders are a lot more than what those checklists are. Those checklists are just personality traits, and everybody has a few of them. But I guarantee you need a preponderance of them developmentally over time that start showing up in childhood, so you need a whole family history. You need psychological testing to really diagnose personality disorder. But I guarantee if you can find your partner on one, your partner can find you on one too. Because of the way you interact, probably neither of you has a personality disorder when you're apart from each other. But when you're interacting with each other, both of you do. Because it's the interaction that's dysfunctional. And if you're attributing that to the personality, then you're both going to seem like you have a personality disorder. But that's a sign of contempt because you're not going on the internet looking for these symptoms out of compassion and caring and love and consideration. You're doing it to explain why that person's such a jerk. We show a comic in our presentations on how to improve your marriage without talking about it. This woman comes in and says, "Honey, I just read an article that explains why you're such an idiot." So you're doing it to feel superior in some way, and that's a morally superior at least, and that is a sign of contempt. Now you use negative labels to reinforce the kind of behavior you don't want and guarantee that you'll get more of it. In other words, if you're saying these things, if you're saying your partner is lazy, they're going to be lazy, because what does a lazy person do? Or don't do? They don't help you. If you call someone selfish, they're not going to be all that motivated to consider your perspective. If you say they're inconsiderate, why should they consider you? They're still going to be inconsiderate. No matter what they do, they're still going to be selfish. They're still going to be lazy. That's what's wrong with negative labels. They eliminate all chance of improvement. The negatively labeled partner or child, and it's actually worse when you do it with a child because their identity is developing, they either give up or worse, identify with the label. I have never seen a case where changes in behavior alone altered contempt. So just your partner changing the behavior that seems to be causing your contempt will do nothing for your contempt. Even if they do everything you want, you'll resent that he or she didn't do it sooner. All the years I wasted with you being a jerk, and now you're better. As long as contempt persists, any behavior change will seem like too little, too late. Now, what you want to realize about contempt is it's become part of your defensive system. It's no longer a reaction to what your partner's doing. It's become part of your way of viewing yourself in relation to your partner. So it's an internal part of you now, and you have to change it. And the motivation to change it is that it makes you contemptuous. When you have contempt for your partner, you're in a contemptuous state yourself. It's impossible to like yourself while you feel contempt. You really can't do it. You deserve to do it, but you can't. It's just the way your brain's designed. Now, although aimed at your partner, it's filled with hidden self-anger and self-contempt for putting up with it. How could I have been so stupid? Why could I have trusted him or her? There's always that kind of self-derogation involved in contempt. Now, if your contempt is advanced, you have to consider it a health issue. That means you can't have any positive thoughts about your partner whatsoever. Or if you have a positive thought, it's immediately followed but, yes, but. That's an advanced contempt. Now, advanced contempt often causes severe physical symptoms, especially when it's a woman who's contemptuous, because most emotional disorders for women are in the fear system, and fear is wired throughout their bodies. So they develop physical symptoms to go along with the anxiety or fear. Serious illness. A contemptuous example of the physical symptoms, a contemptuous person is going to get sick a lot. They're going to get coughs, colds, aches, pains, headaches, stomach aches, because the contempt's lowering the immune system constantly. It's putting a drain on the immune system. And then they will get, besides those minor symptoms, more likely to get serious illnesses like cancer and heart disease. And eventually contempt causes a nervous breakdown. If contempt is advanced, your focus must be on getting well. Forget about your relationship. Put it on the back burner. Focus on core value work and healing yourself. Your health and well-being must be your number one priority. We have a webinar series on CompassionPower.com called Emotional Healing. If you're in advanced contempt, subscribe to that. You've got to get a handle on the contempt before you can even begin to repair your relationship. And that's not to say that your partner doesn't deserve your contempt. He or she very well might. But you don't deserve to suffer from the contempt. Once it becomes part of your defensive system, it's part of you. It's no longer an independent reaction to your partner. Now, if contempt is not advanced, think in terms of behavior you would like to see. Never make it about the personality or character of your loved one. Let me explain that first one a little bit. Contempt makes you focus on what you don't want. Your partner being lazy, what your partner's doing wrong, or what your partner's not doing. What you want to focus on is what you want, not what you don't want. Never make it about the personality or character. Keep it specific about specific behavior. If you make it about your loved one's character, and that's almost always what we do with contempt, if you do that, you're going to run smack into an unconscious process known as projective character identification. We tend to identify with the characterizations that other people project onto us. If someone thinks you're critical, you're likely to find something to criticize about that person. Now, there's empirical evidence for this, but you can find it on the internet if you're interested. But I don't want you to just understand it intellectually. You want to get an emotional grasp of it. So think of friends or acquaintances you have who think of you in a certain way, and we all have them. You'll have some friends who will think you're critical. You're likely to find something to criticize about that person. You'll find that you're more critical around that person than you are anyone else. If you live with someone who believes you're lazy, you won't be terribly motivated to mow the lawn. In other words, we conform to these projections that people make onto us. If someone thinks you're compassionate, you tend to go out of your way to consider that person's feelings. If somebody thinks you're compassionate, you're going to ask them how they're doing. How are they feeling? But you're not likely to do it if they think you're selfish. If an acquaintance thinks you're very intelligent, you're going to try hard not to say stupid things around that person. Now here's an experiment in projective identification. See, it's unconscious and automatic. It's going to work against you because when you're projecting these negative things onto your partner, they're going to be conforming to them and doing more of what you don't like. So we're going to try to use it positively. Now you have to do this as an experiment because it's counterintuitive. So you'll have to do it as an act of faith, a leap of faith. List 3 positive qualities that you will project onto your partner. Don't say what they are, just think of them. You're going to regard that person as, for example, compassionate, helpful, affectionate, sexual, whatever it is that you want to project onto that person. Write them down, but don't show your partner. And for the next 3 weeks, look for evidence of these qualities. So you're assuming that your partner is these qualities, and you're going to look for whatever evidence you can and regard any contrary evidence as uncharacteristic. In other words, if you think your partner is compassionate and they're not noticing that you feel bad, assume it's because they're distracted or overwhelmed or just not getting it. In general, it's not good to make those kind of excuses, but in this experiment for the next 3 weeks, you're going to do it. Because what you're really doing is going to be training yourself to look for more positive qualities. Don't say anything, just regard your partner as having the qualities you project. At the end of the 3 weeks, you should notice your partner conforming more to your projections. So give it 3 weeks. Think of whatever you wrote down, your partner is those things. Convince yourself that he or she is compassionate, affectionate, sexy, whatever it is. Now the secret is your projections change your partner by changing the way you regard him or her. You are far more positive around him or her than when you're resentful and contemptuous. And that's really what's going to change them. But don't focus on that. Don't focus on what you're projecting. Focus on how you regard your partner. The projection will happen on its own. You don't have to focus on that. And the danger is if you do focus on it, you're going to come off as manipulative. So don't think it. Just assume your partner has the qualities you would like them to have. Now, do not internalize contemptuous attributions of your partner. If your partner is contemptuous toward you, and usually that's two-way because it's very reciprocitous. If your partner is contemptuous of you, you're probably contemptuous of him or her too. It's hard, almost very difficult not to be resentful and contemptuous to someone who's resentful and contemptuous to you. Do not let contemptuous attributions by your partner, or anyone else for that matter, disconnect you from your core value or keep you from doing what you deeply believe is right. See, people get trapped in these resentment feedback loops because you're reacting to your partner's resentment, and that makes you violate your own core value and not do what you believe is right or do things you believe is wrong. And the only way out of that is to get to your core value and do what you believe is right regardless of what your partner is doing. Remember, your core value grows from what you do, not from what other people do. Replace contempt with core value. List 3 times you have witnessed your partner being true to his or her core values. For example, compassionate, protective, or caring. So just think 3 times you've seen your partner doing that. Because contempt and advanced resentment makes you overlook them. They are, I guarantee they've been there. You haven't seen them because your brain has conditioned you only to look for the negative things. Now list 3 relationship qualities that you would like to develop more in yourself. For example, patience, listen better, more mindful. So these are 3 qualities you want more of yourself. And this is what I will do to develop these qualities. For example, remind myself that I want to be more patient. Focus on what my partner says. Notice and try to appreciate my environment. So you have to make these behavioral. They can't just be affirmations. Affirmations are worthless unless you have a behavioral component to them. In fact, the biggest way of change is you can start with an affirmation. I'm going to be more patient. I'm going to listen better. I'm going to be more mindful. And then think of what behaviors will do that, will accomplish that for you. Notice and try to appreciate my environment. Imagine yourself doing that and then doing it. So if you do all of those, that produces the most positive neurological change. Now, the order of recovery from chronic resentment, anger, or emotional abuse is the following. Personal healing, core value work. It's not even good to try to repair your relationship as long as you're very hurt, because repairing your relationship is not going to heal your hurt. And it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to even do it. You want most of your emotional energy to go to personal healing. Self-regulation, that's hold on to self-value under stress to act in your long-term best interest. And that's HEALS is a technique for accomplishing that. Now you'll notice these 2 things, those of you who have been to our boot camps, core value and HEALS, that's 2.5 of the 3 days of the boot camp. And then regulate the relationship destroyers, criticism, stonewalling, defensiveness, and contempt, which you really can't do if you don't do these first 2 things. But once you do those first 2 things, then you can turn to these. And from your core value, then you could focus either on rebuilding your relationship or work on co-parenting. From your core value, after doing these first 3, then you can make a more realistic appraisal and have a more realistic chance of success in whichever you decide. Okay, well, thank you for your attention. And